All right, guys. So, once again, here we are in our discussion on worldview. And once again, I still have no heat. So, I've had this hat on to keep my noggin somewhat warm. But I'm just kind of concerned with the professionalism of, or the lack thereof, with my hat on. So, though I desperately don't want to be cold, hence all this get up here. I still, I might go to the hat if I get miserable. I'm gonna try to do without it for the time being, though. Now, having said that, let's get on with our discussion. So, again, we're in worldview, right? We've been talking about various systems, various ideologies, schools of thought, way we could say it, in looking at the world. And so now we have come to theism, right? We've gone through agnosticism, skepticism. We've gone through atheism, specifically the lens of something like nihilism, and what we tried to argue, or at least somewhat give an argument for that the nihilistic position would be the most logically consistent form of atheism. We've looked at pantheism. Um, and so now, at least, we're coming to look at something like theism. Now, theism is going to be similar to a lot of the other views in the sense that uh, it's not necessarily just going to be represented by one particular group in and of itself. There are actually different forms of theism, right? Just like there were different forms of pantheism. Now, these are a little more easy for us to recognize, just because we grow up in a theistic type of culture. We're Westerners for the most part. Now, some of you watching this particular lecture may not necessarily be Western, but if you are, then these terms, these concepts are going to come across as just readily recognizable to you. You're going to be very familiar with this lecture for the most part. Hopefully, there'll be some things here that you pick up that maybe you've overlooked at some point in the past. Now, if you do happen to be in a different part of the world and you're watching this lecture and you're not necessarily Western, well, then this may be just as uh, confusing, possibly, or just as enlightening, maybe, as some of the other views were to the Western students, right? So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and look straight into that. So, theism. Again, there's going to be various versions of theistic belief, right? But these are supposed to be what are going to be the most popular held or most popular versions of theistic type beliefs. Now, I'm trying to find a good place for this camera here. I may just have to move it around intermittently here. Maybe we could just center it there. There we go. Now, Judaism, right, is a form of theism. Islam is a form of theism. Christianity is a form of theism. And there are pockets of theistic belief within other systems, but not necessarily our focus here again. So some would say Zoroastrianism would be something like a form of theism. Now, you may be asking, well, what is theism, right? Well, obviously, in contrast to atheism, if atheism is the belief or the worldview that there just is no God, right? Theism, the Greek, they're negating the term theism there. Well, then theism is just going to be the belief that there is a God. Now, it's also a very specific form of belief in God. It's not like deism, right? Deism would just say that there's a belief in a God, but he has nothing to do with his creation. There's no interaction at all. Just sort of picture the watchmaker that makes a perfectly constructed watch. He winds it up and then he just tosses it out to do its own thing. He just throws it out. It can handle itself and he's out of the picture, right? Now, it's not that. It's similar to that, right? But theism, what distinguishes theism from deism is the fact that theists, right, that theism is the belief that there is a transcendent God that's over and above creation, right? He creates creation, right? He exists independently of creation, just like the deists would argue or say. But theists say that this God is also personal, meaning that this God not only has the ability to interact with his creation, intervene in his creation, so to speak, but that he's actively involved with creation any at all times, right? Not only does he stand apart from and distinct from creation, but he sustains, he withholds creation, he keeps it in existence. But that he's also interacting in the sense that this God, this theistic God, is personal in the sense that he performs miracles, right? That he has it in some. Now, when you get down to the details of this, it may be there may be some particular nuance in how classical theists and what have been called theistic personalists may answer this, but the nuances may differ. But that in some real sense, he has a relationship with his most intimate of creatures, right? The human beings, right? There's a real sense of relation there in some way. Again, there may be a nuance as to how theistic personalists cash that out and how classical theists cash that out. But they both would say that in some sense, theism is the belief that God is personal, right? Not just in the sense that he acts within creation, but personal with you or I, with his creation, with people, right? With humans in some real sense of the word. Now, that's what's going to set, obviously, theism apart and distinct from, obviously, deism. But even as we see pantheism, right? I mean, it's going to say that God is not just this and you and me and everything that exists. God is not that. He's completely distinct. He's other than, right, his creation. He's not synonymous with his creation. And it's going to separate, obviously, it's going to be distinct from atheism. Atheism, just there is no God, personal or anything. Theism, there is a God and he is personal, right? So, again, if you're a theist, right, or if you're growing up in a culture that has heartily embraced a form of theism, then this is going to be nothing to you, right? You completely understand where we are at this point. Again, if you haven't been, if you're in a different culture, then this may be, again, somewhat shocking, possibly. Now, it's hard for us to see, Westerners, how this could be shocking, but to some it may be that weren't reared in this type of cultural context and which helps us shape our understanding of God. Now, when we look at Judaism, when we look at Islam, when we look at Christianity, though these are forms of theism and obviously monotheism, there's going to be some things that differ, right? There's going to be ways in which these types of theisms differ, just as there are ways in which various schools of thought in regards to pantheism differed. But what we're going to try to do, again, is just talk about the stuff, the topics, the material, the concepts that are congruent with each of these, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in some sense, right? So let's go ahead and start to look at that. So when we talk about this, right, when we look at what is common among these, obviously we're going to have God, right, and the understanding of God. We're going to talk about reality. What is reality? What is real? What is the universe on theism, right? Now, again, if you remember, what is God on pantheism? What is reality according to pantheism? What is the universe according to pantheism? What is God's activity? All those, again, those types of questions. So we're going to look at what is God's activity within creation on theism, right? What is mankind? What are we? What is humanity? What are we on theism, right? As theism would answer these types of questions. Now, again, remember, these are big questions. And again, we're also going to go to, we're going to keep in mind towards the end of the lecture, again, how theism would answer those four big questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, right? Because again, each of these worldviews is going to answer them differently, right? Theists are going to answer these questions, these here before you on the screen now, but they're also going to answer, again, keep in mind, those four fundamental questions toward the end. They're going to answer those questions differently than, say, the pantheist is going to answer them, right, if they're being consistent. They're going to answer those questions differently than the atheist is going to answer them, again, if they're being consistent, right? So let's start to look at these. Let's look at the first, God. Now, we've already kind of gone through, again, when I was describing just what theism is, we've kind of gone through already what is God on theism, right? He's personal. He's active, within creation and whatnot. But I want you to get this right here. Look at the slide here. Look at this. He's the ontological, the metaphysical grounding of logic, right? what on earth do we mean by that, right? Remember, pantheists wanted to say that God is beyond logic, beyond intellect, in the sense that logic doesn't even apply, right? The intellectual capacity of mankind just doesn't even apply to the topic of God. There's something other than, in the sense that it's just completely over and above and completely unbound by, or is completely not applicable. But remember, theism says that God may be beyond logic, but not, this is so important, but not in the sense that the pantheist is going to mean by that. The theist, if they're consistent with the theistic framework, and if they're educated, if they're studied in that particular framework, they're going to know that logic itself is not binding upon God, but that logic is just a I don't want to say a character trait, and I don't want to say an attribute, because that's getting in some metaphysical positions that are a little more nuanced than that. But it's basically that logic flows from the very nature of God. It's just God's nature to exhibit logic. Not because logic is arbitrary, and not because God is bound by logic as if there's something over and above God, but it's just a reflection. Logic just is a reflection of God's perfect order, perfect reason, so to speak, the perfect I don't want to say encapsulation, but again, just maybe we can say reflection again of just of the just the perfect reasonableness, so to speak. Now, the question about this ontological grounding of logic is just that if logic is real, and we believe that it is, and if logic is not arbitrary, meaning it's not just made up by some guy over here as opposed to some guy's view over here, if logic actually exists, if it's actually real and it's not arbitrary, then we have to have some sort of grounding. Like, where does logic come from? And not just where does it come from, but what ties this to reality? What's it grounded in ontologically or metaphysically? And then this is where theists would say that logic finds its metaphysical grounding is just in the very nature of God, reflective of the very nature of God himself. Now, what about this business about God being beyond intellect, right? But not contra to intellect, or God being beyond logic, but not contra to logic. The easiest way to understand this would be to look at something, again, like the concept of the Trinity, right? Now, within Christian theism, Christians believe that there is one God, right? They're monotheists. But they also believe, right, that God is tri-personal, right? They believe there's one God, there's one nature, one essence of God, the Godhead, so to speak. But this God is in some sense tri-personal. Now, it's not logically contradictory, right? It's not logically contradictory to say that there is one God and three persons, or one essence and three persons, one nature and three persons, right? That's not contradictory. It would be contradictory to say that there is one God and three gods, right? Or one person and three persons, right? Something like that would be contradictory. So this is what we mean to say that, well, I can't comprehend, I can't put my mind around what it means to say there's only one God, but there's three persons. That's what it means. That's what the theist would mean when they would say that God is beyond logic, or beyond the human's ability to intellectually conceptualize, right, God. But it's, again, the important distinction is that to note that it's not logically contradictory. Remember, God may be beyond logic, right? He may be beyond the human ability to intellectually conceptualize, but he's not contradictory to it, right? It's very important to keep that in mind, because that's a very stark difference between the theist and the pantheist, even though they may be using similar terminology there. It's important that we don't get confused with that. We could give other examples, but the Trinitarian conception of the Christian God would be something like that. Now, within other forms of theism, that may be arguable, in the sense that there are a number of Islamic philosophers and Islamic scholars that would say that God can, for instance, will whatever he wants to will to be the good, as opposed to what is right or wrong, right? What you would normally think of right or wrong. Well, that would pose some sort of problem for God being able to do that which is just logically contradictory, right? The classical Christian conception of right and wrong would be that they're absolute, right? They're true in the sense that they couldn't be any other way. And again, they would say that because those rights and wrongs are grounded in the nature of God himself, and because the nature of God himself is a reflection of logic, let me say it this way, logic is a reflection of the nature of God, that they can't be any other way. They couldn't contradict themselves. God couldn't contradict himself, rather, because he can't go against his nature. His nature just is the grounding of logic itself. Again, that may be a little too in depth for what you're having to deal with right now. This is just basic worldview, so we're just going to try to keep it on that level, try not to get too far in the deep end right there. So let's just keep going. Now, I made a mistake in my slide here. I didn't change this up. You'll see up here where I keep it says pantheism still as opposed to theism. All right, that's my mistake. Now, again, so we talked about God. Now with reality, what do theists believe that reality to encompass, right? Or what is reality under theism? What is real? What is the universe under theism? Now, remember, there's a heavy distinction, a very true, very distinct distinction, right? If that's not just completely redundant and unnecessary and superfluous to say, there is a distinction between God and his creation, right? On the one hand, you have God who is over and above and transcendent over his creation. And then you have creation, meaning that you have something that is real, but it's not God in any shape, form, or fashion, and it won't be God. Right? God is God. That which is not God, right? And it won't be God, even though it is real, so to speak. So theists believe in what's called creation ex nihilo, meaning that God created all that is seen, right? The heavens, the earth, people, angels, whatever else that exists. God created all of that, all of this from nothing. Right? There was nothing there, and that's just what it means to say creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. Now, again, look at this in contrast to pantheism, right? That pantheism would say that God didn't create in any sense that there's something independent of him. He just is his creation, right? Now, you see how this is in stark contrast to pantheism. It just says that whatever exists, that God created, whether it's physical or whether it's non-physical. Now, a lot of people believe too, there's been this ideology that has crept in within even theistic circles, that the physical, the material, right, the things that are composed of matter are somehow less than real, not good in some sense of the word. But traditionally and classically, that's just not true, right? That's just not the actual teaching of theism. That the teaching of theism is that all that God created was originally good, right? Now it may be tainted in some sense, right, by further theological, ramifications of what the particular form of theism may teach. But that if something exists, whether it be material or immaterial, that originally, at least, it was good, right? And there's nothing evil, quote unquote, about the material world or matter, right? Now, what you do with those types of things may be good or evil. But just the fact that matter exists, it's not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing under the classical conception of what theism would have taught. And what most in the know theists would still teach is that there's nothing wrong with matter. God made matter. God made the immaterial realm as well. They're both fine, right? In and of themselves, in principle, in and of themselves. Now, that would encompass the physical, right? Like if we look at our slide here, when we talk about the physical realm, right? God created the physical realm. But again, we've got this other aspect here too, this last line on the slide, the non-physical, spiritual or otherwise, right? What do you mean when we say spiritual or otherwise? Because wouldn't it just mean to say that you may be thinking this, wouldn't it just stand to reason that if something is not physical, then it just is spiritual? So why do you say or and otherwise? Well, not necessarily, right? Because this would be a very interesting way to get into a super in-depth topic about metaphysics, right, and philosophy, what is real, right? Metaphysics just being the branch of philosophy that studies the discipline that studies what is, right, being, the study of being. Now, just a quick interlude here. Classical belief is that it's not just that matter exists, physical exists, and the soul exists, right? And angels and whatever else exists. But there would also be this belief in what are called forms or natures or essences, right? So Aristotle would call them the formal cause. He would say the nature of the essence just is the formal cause of a thing, right? And this would go on down the line in regards to classical Christian teaching. Now, if something like forms exist, if something like the true nature or essence of a dog exists, right, then those are immaterial, right? Those are immaterial things that exist, that are real, and that God created them, right? The nature, the essence of a dog or a woman, man, the nature or essence of trees, right? Anything that exists, and if it has a nature and an essence and that's real, well, then God created that too, right? That's just to say that God is the maker of all things, if they're real, physical, spiritual, and or otherwise. Say it this way, physical, spiritual, or immaterial existence. But he's not any of those particular things, right? He's distinct from them, though they do exist, right? So maybe you have at least a little intro in there to what something maybe you didn't know before. Maybe you just thought that theists believe that God created souls and physical stuff, right? Or spiritual things and physical things, right? But there's actually a whole other category of things that aren't necessarily spiritual, but they're immaterial, namely forms, essences, natures, those sorts of things. Now, we've already discussed this when we were talking about just God's interaction with the world, right? God's activity within creation. We've got the question mark of miracles, right? Under theism, does God perform miracles? Yes, God performs miracles under theism. That just means that is just to say that God intervenes within his creation. So philosopher Ron Nash used to like to use this example in a book called, I believe it was Worldviews and Conflict, maybe, and probably some other areas as well. But he used to like to use the example of this. Imagine that you or I represent God. Again, I'm not trying to be blasphemous in any sense, just to try to, for the sake of the argument, sake of the analogy here, is that say you or I represent God, and let's say that creation is represented by this hat. Nash actually uses a box, right? And so within this hat is the universe, right? So this may be something that exists within the universe. This is something that exists within the universe. This is something that exists within the universe. Imagine I'm throwing something else in here. Here's the universe, everything that exists within it. When the theist says that God can intervene in the universe, it's just to say this: look, God can intervene. He can take this and move it here. He can do this. He can perform miracles. He can, if this paper's torn, say that it's torn. I don't know if you can actually see that on the screen. The tear there, there's some contrast. The paper is torn. Well, that God can intervene within his universe and restore the paper if he wants to, right? When you think of the creation being distinct from the creator, well, it just means to say that the creator has not thrown away his abilities or proclivities or the possibility that he can reach into creation and do as he wishes, right? Now, a lot of people would think that that's just what it means to say that God is involved in creation. But there's actually a much deeper understanding among theists, specifically classical theists, about what it means to say that God is involved within creation. Of course, miracles, right? That's a given, miracles. But I want you to pay attention to this second aspect here where it starts with however. However, theism also teaches that God actually sustains the universe in existence at all times. So it's not just that God is just kind of standing back, waiting for a chance to do a miracle, then he intervenes in it. Then he's active in the world by doing a miracle. But that there's never any moment in time that God is not, by his divine fiat, by his will, sustaining, upholding, keeping all things in existence right at this very moment. Right? So that if you exist right now, it is because of the pleasure of God that he's sustaining your very existence. He's not just involved in the sense of, he's not just able to interact in the world in the sense of he comes and performs a miracle in your life or whatnot, or someone else's, but he's actually keeping you in existence right now as you breathe, right? As your heart beats, he's holding you in existence. So that even this is I don't want to say that it's better. I'm not trying to compare them in that sense, but it's almost a more robust sense of what it means for the theist to say that God is active in the world, right? They may even quote some scripture like, in him we move and have our being, right? Or Paul quoting some other pagan philosopher, but Paul seems to, the implication being that he's not necessarily wrong in that specific belief, right? That it's because of God that we're able to move and have our being. He sustains you in existence, even at this very moment. Now, what is mankind on theism, right? Just what are people? What is humanity, right? Well, obviously, as we mentioned, just a slide or two ago, when we were talking about what exists, right? What actually is real, whether it be physical or non-physical. One of the things that just kind of slid naturally into the conversation there was just the fact of souls, right? Now, theists are going to teach that people have souls, right? Now, you do have these odd sorts of views, represented by various pockets of some theists that would say that there's no such thing as a soul, that you're just physical and whatnot. But by and large, theists don't hold to that. Most theists and most schools of thought within theism officially even hold that mankind is not just a physical thing, right? That mankind is a soul and body composite in some sense, right? Now, you've got this sort of difference of views here. Many of you may not even be aware of this, but a lot of people hold to what's called a Cartesian dualism in regards to what it means to have a soul and a body. Almost that they're just completely independent of one another and don't really even need one another in some sense. And that would be something like the Cartesian type dualist. You have a soul, you're primarily just a soul, right? And then you have this body that you just happen to have physically, right? Now, classically, up until around the Enlightenment era philosophy, one of the more popular views, still here even now, but it was just this view called holomorphism, And this was the understanding that you couldn't just dissect the soul away from the body and there'd be no sort of consequence in some sense. Holomorphism is the view that there is a very real, very deep interconnectedness, right? Easy for me to say. There's a very real and very deep interconnectedness between the soul, what Aquinas would call the formal cause of the body, right? Again, we're getting into deep metaphysics there, but there's a deep interconnectedness between the soul and the actual body itself. So think of it like this. If Cartesian dualism is something like this, where they're intertwined in some sense like this, think of holomorphism as if there's imagine them, they're distinct, obviously, in some sense, right? But they're just so interconnected that when you take away one from the other, say at death, that there's a real genuine, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a real genuine disconnect, that something's not right, that it ought not be that way, that there really is something truly lost in the sense of one being separated a person's soul being separated from their body, that's not the way that it's supposed to be. Opposed to this view of, your soul's it just can take the body here, that just really is irrelevant to one's existence. The holomorphic view is there's this really deep interconnectedness between the soul and the body, though they are distinct in some sense. Again, you can do some more research on that. There may be even go into some of that in our text. Now, they would both, obviously, and all theists hold this, all theists would hold that the soul survives death, right? That when you die, that's not, in the most strict sense of the word, the end of you, meaning that you actually do exist, right? That you do have some sort of ability to transcend your death, right? And when I say transcend, that may be a poor choice of words. You're just able to outlast your death in some sense. You're able to survive your death in some sense of the word. Now, again, in contrast to atheism, right, that you just are your material body, and when you die, that's it, right? The brain waves stop, you stop, period. Theists would say that the brain waves may stop, the body may die, but you still exist, right, in some sense. Now, they also, most forms of theism that would claim that you also, not only do you survive death, but you're going to face judgment in some sense, right? That it really does matter, how you do live this life, that you're going to face judgment in some sense. Some would argue that it will be later down the road, at an appointed time of judgment when there's a resurrection at some point. Some would argue that you just face judgment immediately. But for the most part, generally speaking, all agree that you survive death and that you're going to face judgment in some sense. This is a belief common to theisms, right? Various theisms. Now, let's start to look at how this makes sense, or how theism tries to make sense of these four questions, right? Our four main topics here. Our four fundamental questions, again, that were originally given by somebody like Zacharias, right? Well, and when I say originally given, I mean, I'm sure there's probably someone else, but at least whom we're taking our lead from here. Now, origin, right? What are we? How did we get here, right? So when we say at origin, again, we're saying, how did we get here? Where did we come from? Where did all this come from? Everything pertinent in that regard. Theists are going to argue, remember, just in regards to creation, that God created everything, right? Creation ex nihilo. That if it exists, if it's real, then God created it. It's not God, but it is his creation, right? Now, and in terms of us, in terms of humanity, not only were we created, right, according to theism, but, and specifically Christian theism is going to say that you are literally made in the very image of God, right? In Latin, this is the imago Dei, right? That you are literally made in the very image of God himself, which, again, this is going to give you, according to theists, something like intrinsic value, right? That you're valuable in and of yourself, you're not valuable just because you're some means to some particular end, but that you have value in and of yourself because you are made in the very image of your Creator. Now, we can get into all sorts of theological discussions about what it means to be made in the image of your Creator. Does that have some sort of moral connotation in the sense that it means that we have the capacity to act morally or immorally? Does it have something to do with the fact that we're able to reason? We're made to make valid inferences and deduce certain truths from principles apart from just blind causal action and reactions. So there's that. There are those theological conversations that can be had about what it actually means to be made in God's image. But theists, specifically Christian theists, are going to say that whatever it means to be made in God's image, we are, right? That we're made in God's image in some sense, right? Now, meaning, this can get kind of messy too, again, when you're talking about which particular form of theism that you're talking about. But by and large, theists are going to say that your meaning, right, your purpose, if we want to say it that way, your telos, right, the teleological aspect of being a human person is to love, to know, to serve, to glorify God. in a rich and robust fashion. Now, Christians are going to say that that's going to be in an intimate sense, right? That you're going to have an actual relationship with God. So these aren't just duty bound sorts of things. Say like in like the Islamic conception of meaning, like you just serve God out of duty. That's your purpose. Christians are going to say that you do serve God out of duty, that there's an obligation to love and to serve and to live for God. But they're also going to say that part of this purpose, part of this meaning is to actually have an actual relationship with God, this intimate form of relationship. I mean, that's just the best way to say it. Just whatever we would normally think of the term relationship, analogously, we're going to have that, theists would say, with God in some sense, right? Now, not only is it your purpose, not only does it give you meaning, or that's how you find your meaning, is to love and to know and to serve God, but there's also going to be this aspect you'll see in the slide that it's part of the way you do this, your purpose, whatever your talents are, right? And I'm just using that word because that's a word that's used within the Christian text, right? The Christian scriptures itself, is that whatever God has gifted you with, right? Well, part of this meaning is to use that, right, in your journey of loving and serving and glorifying Him in some sense. So again, imagine someone that's just incredibly gifted athletically, or imagine they're gifted musically, or whatever it is, that these pre-programmed, if we want to say it that way, use that term a little loosely there, but these dispositions that you have, then part of your meaning, part of your purpose, part of your what it means for you to actualize your potential is to use those sorts of things in your pursuit of loving and serving and knowing and glorifying God, right? At least part of that. That's going to be part of the equation there. Now, let's look at morality. Now, again, atheism, in contrast to atheism, remember, atheism is not going to say that you just need to run around, or atheists are not going to say that you need to run around acting moral and whatnot, right? But what we try to argue is that something like that nihilism is really more the true logical implication or consequence of something like atheism. Now, this is going to be in contrast to theism, right? Because theists are going to say that there is an objective right way in which you should live, right? There's an objective, transcendent standard of behavior, right? Standard of morality that you need to actually live by, right? Whether you like it or not, whether you think it's good or not, whether you're fooled into believing or disbelieving it exists, they're going to say that there's this real objective standard of behavior or ethic that you ought to live by. But what we're interested in this particular with this concern is that just this meta-ethical consideration of this. Because you may have theists that would say that it's going to be a divine command type of ethic, DCT here, or the next, NTL, a natural law type of conception of morality. There may be various arguments as to how we know what's right or wrong, all these sorts of things. But basically what they're going to try to argue is that you're still going to have this grounding within God in some way to have this rich, robust, obligatory type of ethic, right? That you're supposed to live in such and such a way, right? And they're going to say that theism, God's existence, is going to provide this ontological or this metaphysical grounding for the way in which we ought to live. Now, again, in contrast to say something like atheism, right? The worldview of atheism, they're going to say, well, no, there's still a way that we ought to live, and it is divine. It's actually, deontological type ethic, or it's one of these others. But the theist is going to say, all right, fine, but you've lost the metaphysical grounding for this. You've lost any sort of rich, robust, obligatory sense in which to say that we ought to follow that ethical theory or whatever. So at the end of the day, the basic thrust of this is that morality is determined by, or let me say it this way a little less controversially, is grounded by the existence of God. It's going to be whatever particular theory of ethic that you hold to, it's still going to have its grounding in the nature of God, right? It's still going to be grounded in the nature of God, which is going to provide that objective, transcendent realness and sense of moral obligation to this whole aspect of how you should live and what we should do, right? Now, let's look at destiny. What is the destiny of mankind, right? Now, it's arguable what the destiny of the created order is going to be, right? As far as creation aside from mankind. Some would argue that it just ceases to disappear. God wipes it out and you just go living with God in heaven or whatever. And some would argue, and I'm talking about Christian theism specifically right now, some would argue that God is going to renew the current state of things, right? He's going to make right what really is here now, what really does exist, and this will be completely made new. God restores creation as it was intended to be, right? Either way, right, the destiny of mankind, however, is to enjoy everlasting communion with God eternally, right? Again, within restored creation. Now, there's also the negative aspect of that, right? The destiny of mankind is to either enjoy everlasting communion and fellowship with God within a restored creation, or conversely, it's going to be an eternal separation from God. And of course, different forms of theism are going to answer this question differently in regards to how you fix this problem, so to speak, right? How do you enjoy everlasting communion with God on, say, Christianity? How do you enjoy everlasting communion with God on Islam, right? There's going to be different answers to that. Now, what they're both going to try to say is that in some real way justice is done, right? That at the end, at the eschaton, when all things are done, at the judgment day, when God breaks into the picture, so to speak, and ends it all, that those who have not since died are going to enter in with those who have died, enjoy everlasting communion with him, or be separated from God forever. But all forms of theism want to say that somehow real justice is done in the end, right? And again, that's going to be answered differently according to which particular theism that you're talking about, right? Now, we would probably argue that the Christian form of theism is going to try to have the most rich and robust sense of justice, in that justice or that evil is punished via Jesus on the cross, and forgiveness is offered and relationship with God is offered as a byproduct of that atoning work of, say, Christ, as opposed to other monotheisms like, say, Islam, where God can just forgive based on his will, right? It just arbitrarily, you've done enough good things, I'll forgive you. Christians would argue that that's going to make God's let me say it this way, that's going to make the conception of justice watered down, so to speak, because really evil is being swept under the rug, as opposed to evil really being dealt a judgment, so to speak, by a good, holy, righteous God, as it was, say, on the cross. But again, those are theological conversations that are very important and interesting. But here we're just trying to cover what they hold to in a loose sense, what they agree on in a loose sense here. Now, one of the things, too, that we want to conclude with this with in regards to theism is, let's look at the logical implications and the existential, right? So we've tried to go through each of our worldviews and look at the logical implications to see if there were any problems logically, and that we've tried to look at the existential implications of that, right? Can you actually live with that type of worldview? Remember, think of those existential implications of atheism, right? Nihilism. What would that mean like to live as if you were the product of time plus matter plus chance, right? What would that look like if you tried to actually live by the fact that if nihilism were true, that there was no ultimate meaning, ultimate purpose, there was no morality, there was no destiny, but the cosmic heat, death, those sorts of things, or on pantheism? What would that look like to live like you're on this eternal karmic wheel to pay off your karmic debt, so to speak? Reincarnation, you don't really exist, all those sorts of things, right? Well, let's try to look at that in regards to theism. The fact that God created, right, the belief of theism is that God created out of nothing, right? And the fact that God created you in his image. Let's look, even though I have it worded here the opposite, let's look at it in the backwards fashion, existentially. Can you actually live as if you're made in the image of God? Can you live like people are valuable in and of themselves? The question is not, are you doing that, right? The question is, can you do that in a way when you're actually thinking about it? Because most people would argue that you actually are living, existentially speaking, you're actually living as if you have value, right? As if you're not just created from the dust, and then you'll just die back into dust once again. That you don't actually see yourself as just a product of blind and different forces, time plus matter plus chance, but you see yourself as something like valuable, right? And in order to treat other people as invaluable, you have to in some way suppress that or try to justify that or rationalize away why they shouldn't be treated that way, right? Now, are there any logical difficulties with believing that this is the theistic conception of origins? Well, the logical difficulty might be something like the belief that God created something out of nothing, right? Now, the theist is going to answer, though, that there's no logical difficulty in saying that something brought something into existence, right? They're not, the theist is going to say that that it's not as if something popped into being out of nothing, right? In fact, they're going to say that that's what the atheist is forced to believe, that or an infinite regress. They're going to argue, the theist is going to say that God was there. There's never a time when there was nothing, right? Because God is always present. And then God, by his power, his omnipotence and whatever, created something from nothing, right? So the question really is, are we going to believe that nothing caused something or that something made something from nothing, right? Now, there's no logical contradiction there. It maybe go beyond the human ability to reason, but it's clearly not illogical. And I might argue that it's more plausible than saying that nothing came or that something came from nothing, right? I think then you really have the difficulty there, to put it nicely. Now, let's look at meaning, right? Is there anything illogical? Is there anything that's existentially can you live this way? Can you actually live as if people have meaning? Can you actually live as if your life has meaning, as opposed to complete non-meaning, right? As opposed to just complete relativism. Can people actually live as if they have meaning? Well, I think the obvious answer would be, well, yeah. I think that's, as we looked at earlier, most people go through their life assuming that there's meaning and that there's purpose, right? Now, would there be any logical difficulties with this aspect of living your life as if has meaning? To be honest, I can't see that there would be anything illogical to live as if life has meaning. I can't see anything illogical with that. In fact, if we were to reverse that, I can see how it'd be very difficult to say that there is no meaning, right? Because then that does seem illogical, because it's immediately a self-defeating statement, right? To say there is no meaning is just to mean that, right? Even if you were trying to reword it and say, well, there is no ultimate meaning, well, that would be self-defeating, right? Because the claim is there is no ultimate meaning, while simultaneously claiming the ultimate answer, so to speak, is that there is no ultimate answer, right? Well, again, that seems self-defeating in some sense. We could cash that out in much further detail if need be, but there is that. Now, morality, is there anything logical? Is there any sort of logical contradiction or existential problem with saying that people live as if they ought to live a certain way? Existentially, do people live? Can they live as if they really think that they ought to be doing a certain sort of thing? Well, yeah, again, I think that most people assume that they ought to live a certain way, that there really is some sort of right or wrong, that they should be living like, right, or living in accord with, I should say. It seems like existentially that most people live as if things really are wrong and some things really are right, right? Now, logically, is there any logical difficulty with saying there are absolute moral principles, right? Or there are objective moral principles that are grounded in God's existence, right? Well, the only logical difficulty that's usually been thrown at that would be something like the Euthyphro dilemma, right? And the Euthyphro dilemma is just to say that, well, God commands things to be right, and so therefore they're arbitrary, right? And if he's not commanding things, but there are right things, then God is subservient to whatever he's commanding them to be in accord with, right? Now, we don't have time because that's not the focus of this class, but suffice to say that objection has been answered numerous times. There's just no logical problem there. Of course, you don't have to take my word for that. Look into our texts and the readings. Then you can do a little additional research if you like. You can Google William Lane Craig or go to Reasonable Faith, his website, to see how this Euthyphro dilemma has been answered almost ad nauseum, right? There's just no logical problem there. Now, in regards to destiny, do people realize or live like, when we look at it existentially, do people live like they're, do people actually live as if their life is going to have a bigger or impact than just laying on their deathbed and that being it, just being completely snuffed out of existence and ceasing to exist? Well, I think that most people live. There's kind of an assumption that what they do actually matters, and that's going to be taken into account in some sense, even when they die, right? That's the existential aspect. Now, the logical problem, would there be any logical problem? Is there any contradiction in believing that there's some sort of destiny that awaits you, either for the good or the ill? There doesn't seem to be any sort of logical contradiction. Again, that's not to say that it makes it automatically true. No one's trying to make that type of argument. They're just the point just being there doesn't seem to be any sort of logical contradiction in saying that that people survive their death, right? The only way that would maybe be some sort of contradictions if you had to, believe a priori that there is no afterlife or just there is no soul, right? But that's a different argument than just saying that people can somehow survive their death in some way, some shape, form, or fashion, right? Now, what do you think are the conclusions here in regards to theism? It seems like that theism is a very plausible worldview in the sense that existentially it makes so much of our common sense notions, the way that people actually live, it seems to fit very nicely with that, right? Like the teachings of theism seem to fit nicely with the way we actually see people live. That's not to say that people live consistently with they ought to live a certain way, do the right thing, people are created in God's image, so on and so forth. But it just seems to say, that there's this assumption in the way that people would live and do live, if examined, if thought about, that fits nicely with what the theistic worldview is going to try to claim, right? Now, again, we don't have time to get into this because this wasn't philosophy proper. It was more of just a worldview analysis. Again, hopefully our text will go into that a little more depth there. But it seems, again, too, like that theism just offers a very nice, robust system of thought in which to ground things like logic, right? Ground things like philosophical principles and templates that we believe to make sense about the world around us and whatnot. I think theism is capable, more than capable, of grounding something like our experience and our abilities to reason. Again, we didn't have time to go into great depth there because, again, it's a worldview analysis. Now, this could technically be the last lecture, but I at least want to give you one more, maybe two, but at least one more that's going to help you. It's going to kind of give you a way to navigate through conversations and when you talk to people, when you're trying to diagnose whatever the particular worldview is that they actually hold to. How do you diagnose that? How do you find out what somebody actually believes? And then how can you steer the conversation in a non-confrontational type of way, to maybe point out some of the implications in their worldview, to maybe point out some of the logical consequences of what they're actually espousing. Is there a way to do that? Well, yes, there is. It's called the Socratic method, right? And there's various forms of that. But we're going to look at one particular form of the Socratic method, and that would be something like Greg Koukl's, what he calls tactical approach. So hopefully we'll be able to look at that next lecture. And until then, let's hope that I get some heat up in this mix.